In the fall of 1941, the German Luftwaffe began losing planes over Belgium at an impossible rate. Not to Allied fighters, not to anti-aircraft fire, but to ghosts. 100 warplanes vanished or destroyed before they could complete their bombing runs over Britain. The Nazi high command was furious, desperate to find the leak. They never suspected that the intelligence bleeding them dry was being gathered by a network of women hiding in plain sight, operating under a code name that would become legend, the Red Orchestra. This is the story they tried to erase from history. Before we reveal how these women dismantled Hitler's air superiority, you need to understand what occupied Belgium looked like in 1941. The country had fallen in just 18 days back in May of 1940, crushed under the blitzkrieg that stunned the world. By 1941, Brussels was a city of whispers and fear. Nazi officers walked the cobblestone streets like they owned them, because they did. Swastikas hung from every government building, curfews were enforced with bullets, and collaborators, the Belgians who chose survival over resistance, were everywhere, watching, listening, reporting. For most people, the war meant keeping your head down, feeding your family, and praying the Gestapo never knocked on your door. But for a small group of women scattered across Brussels, Antwerp, and Liège, the war meant something else entirely. It meant revenge. These were not soldiers. They were not spies trained in the dark arts of espionage by some foreign government. They were teachers, nurses, secretaries, housewives, women who had watched their country fall, who had seen their neighbors dragged away in the night, who had buried sons and husbands killed in the invasion, women who decided that doing nothing was worse than dying. And so, quietly, carefully, they began to organize. They passed messages hidden in grocery baskets. They memorized flight schedules overheard in cafes, where German pilots drank too much and talked too freely. They sketched airfield layouts on scraps of paper and tucked them into the linings of their coats. And slowly, piece by piece, they built something the Nazis never saw coming. An intelligence network so effective, so invisible, that it would cost the Third Reich 100 aircraft and countless lives. The architect of this network was a woman named Suzanne Spaak, though even that name is barely a footnote in most history books. Born into Belgian aristocracy, Suzanne had everything to lose and chose to lose it anyway. She was elegant, educated, fluent in 4 languages, and married to a successful playwright. She could have spent the war in comfort, sipping tea in her Brussels townhouse and pretending the occupation was temporary. Instead, she became a ghost. She recruited other women carefully, one at a time, looking for the same quiet fury she felt burning inside herself. She taught them how to watch without being seen, how to listen without being heard, how to move through a city crawling with Gestapo agents like smoke through a keyhole. And she gave them a purpose: to feed the Allies every scrap of intelligence they could gather about Luftwaffe operations in Belgium. By the summer of 1941, the Red Orchestra was operational, and the Luftwaffe was bleeding. But the women had no idea that their success had painted a target on all of their backs. The Gestapo was closing in, and the hunt for the invisible enemy had just begun. The German intelligence apparatus in 1941 was one of the most sophisticated surveillance machines ever built. The Gestapo, the Abwehr, the SD, all of them working in tandem, turning occupied Europe into a web of informants and fear. In Belgium alone, there were thousands of collaborators, paid informants who would sell out their neighbors for a few extra ration cards or the promise of safety. The Nazis had files on everyone. They monitored mail, tapped phone lines, planted agents in cafes and churches and factories. And yet somehow critical intelligence about Luftwaffe operations kept leaking out of Belgium and into Allied hands. Bomber formations that should have reached London were being intercepted over the Channel. Airfields that were supposed to be secret were being hit by precision strikes. Supply convoys were vanishing. The Nazi leadership knew they had a problem, but they had no idea how deep it ran, or that the people responsible were the ones they considered least dangerous. Women. The brilliance of the Red Orchestra was in its simplicity. These women did not operate like traditional spies. They did not carry weapons or use dead drops in shadowy alleyways. They were invisible because they were ordinary. Helene Moskowitz worked as a nurse in a hospital that treated wounded German soldiers. She smiled at them, brought them water, listened to them brag about where their units were being deployed next. André de Jong was a commercial artist who sketched landscapes, but her real work was mapping the locations of anti-aircraft batteries and fuel depots she observed on her walks through the countryside. Suzanne Spaak hosted small dinner parties for Belgian intellectuals, and occasionally a German officer would attend, flattered by the attention of high society, never realizing that every word he spoke was being memorized and passed along. The women moved through the city like water, filling every crack, impossible to stop because they were impossible to see. But gathering intelligence was only half the battle. The real challenge was getting it out of Belgium and into the hands of the British. The women needed a courier network, a way to move information across borders that were sealed tight by Nazi patrols. This is where the network truly became an orchestra, each woman playing her part in perfect coordination. Messages were encoded in innocuous letters, hidden in the false bottoms of suitcases, sewn into the hems of dresses. Couriers, often young women barely out of their teens, would carry these packages across Belgium into France, and from there into neutral Switzerland or Spain, where British intelligence operatives were waiting. One courier, a 23-year-old woman named André Dumont, made over 30 trips across the border, each one a roll of the dice with her life. She was stopped by patrols twice, searched, questioned, and both times she walked away because the soldiers saw only a frightened girl with nothing to hide. The intelligence the Red Orchestra provided was devastating. In August of 1941, they transmitted the exact coordinates of a Luftwaffe airfield outside Antwerp, where dozens of bombers were being staged for a massive raid on London. 2 days later, the RAF obliterated the airfield. In September, they warned the British about a convoy of fuel tankers moving through the Ardennes, and the convoy was destroyed before it reached the German lines. In October, they provided detailed information about a new fighter squadron being deployed to Belgium, including the names of the pilots, their training records, and the weaknesses in their aircraft. The squadron was decimated in its first engagement. One by one, the planes fell from the sky, and the Nazis had no idea why. But in Berlin, the counterintelligence officers were starting to connect the dots. The leaks were too precise, too consistent, too damaging to be coincidence. Someone in Belgium was feeding the Allies a steady stream of high-level intelligence, and the Gestapo was determined to find them. They began arresting suspected resistance members, torturing them for information, executing them in public as a warning. The noose was tightening, and the women of the Red Orchestra knew that their time was running out. The question was no longer if they would be caught, but when and how many of them would survive. The first arrest came in November of 1941, and it sent shockwaves through the network. A courier named Rita Konus was stopped at a checkpoint outside Brussels, and this time the soldiers were not fooled. They found encoded messages sewn into the lining of her coat, messages that detailed German troop movements and Luftwaffe flight schedules. She was taken to Gestapo headquarters on Avenue Louise, a beautiful Art Nouveau building that had become a house of horrors. For 3 days, they tortured her, demanding names, addresses, the structure of the network. Rita gave them nothing. On the 4th day, they executed her in the courtyard, a bullet to the back of the head, and dumped her body in an unmarked grave. The Gestapo thought they had cut off a single thread, but what they had actually done was set off an alarm. The Red Orchestra now knew that the Germans were hunting them in earnest, and that every move they made could be their last. Suzanne Spaak made the decision that would define the network's survival. They would not stop. Stopping meant all the risks, all the losses, all the intelligence they had gathered would be for nothing. Stopping meant the Nazis won. Instead, she ordered the network to adapt. They changed their communication methods, switching from written messages to verbal codes passed through trusted intermediaries. They abandoned safe houses that had been used too many times. They recruited new couriers to replace the ones who had been caught or killed. And most importantly, they accelerated their operations, pushing to gather as much intelligence as possible before the Gestapo closed in completely. It was a gamble, a choice to burn brighter and faster rather than fade into the shadows. Suzanne knew it might cost them everything, but she also knew that the intelligence they were providing was saving lives, Allied lives, and that had to be worth the risk. The women began taking chances they never would have dared before. Helene Moskowitz started stealing medical records from the hospital, documents that listed the names and injuries of German pilots, which allowed the Allies to track which squadrons were combat-ready and which were depleted. André de Jong expanded her mapping operation, venturing closer to active military installations, sketching fortifications and airfield layouts with a precision that bordered on reckless. And Suzanne herself began cultivating a new source, a low-level Wehrmacht officer named Klaus Weber, who was disillusioned with the war and desperate for someone to confide in. She met him in cafes, listened to his doubts, and slowly, carefully turned him into an asset. Weber gave her access to logistical reports, fuel inventories, and maintenance schedules for the Luftwaffe bases in Belgium. It was a goldmine of information, and Suzanne squeezed every drop out of it, even as she knew that one wrong word, one moment of suspicion, could mean her death. The intelligence kept flowing to London, and the results were undeniable. Between November of 1941 and February of 1942, the Luftwaffe lost more aircraft over Belgium and northern France than in any comparable period of the war. British fighters seemed to know exactly where and when German bombers would appear. Supply lines dried up. Airfields were bombed hours after new squadrons arrived. The German high command was in chaos, demanding answers, demanding blood. And the Gestapo, under immense pressure to stop the bleeding, unleashed a wave of terror across Belgium. They arrested hundreds of people, many of them completely innocent, torturing them for information that most of them did not have. Entire neighborhoods were placed under surveillance. Collaborators were given bonuses to turn in anyone acting suspiciously. The streets of Brussels became a minefield, and every woman in the Red Orchestra knew that a single mistake, a single slip, would bring the Gestapo to their door. But the network held. Despite the arrests, despite the fear, despite watching their friends disappear into Gestapo headquarters and never come out, the women of the Red Orchestra kept working. They kept gathering intelligence, kept passing messages, kept feeding the Allies the information that was dismantling the Luftwaffe piece by piece. They had become something the Nazis could not comprehend. Ordinary women who had chosen to become warriors and who were willing to die rather than surrender. The question now was not whether the Gestapo would find them, but whether they could complete their mission before the hammer finally fell. By the spring of 1942, the Gestapo had assigned their most ruthless officer to the Belgian case, Heinrich Reiser, a man whose reputation for brutality was legend even among his own colleagues. Reiser had broken resistance networks in France and Holland, leaving trails of bodies and burned safe houses in his wake. He arrived in Brussels with a single mandate: find the source of the leaks and destroy it, no matter the cost. Reiser was methodical, patient, and utterly without mercy. He studied the pattern of intelligence losses, cross-referenced them with arrests and interrogations, and began to build a profile of his enemy. What he discovered surprised him. The timing of the leaks, the nature of the information, the way it moved through the city all pointed to something he had not expected, a network run primarily by women. It was an idea that offended his sense of order, the notion that housewives and shopgirls could outwit the Reich's intelligence apparatus. But Reiser was not a man who let pride cloud his judgment. If women were the enemy, then women would be his targets. Reiser's first move was to tighten the noose around the courier routes. He placed undercover agents at train stations, bus depots, and border crossings, all of them instructed to watch for women traveling alone or carrying suspicious packages. He ordered his men to search women more aggressively at checkpoints, to question them longer, to look for any sign of nervousness or deception. And he began pulling strings in the collaborator network, offering larger rewards for information about women involved in resistance activities. The effect was immediate and chilling. 2 couriers were arrested in the same week, both of them caught at the French border with encoded messages hidden in their luggage. One of them, a 19-year-old girl named Marguerite Bevois, broke under interrogation and gave up 3 names before she was executed. Those 3 women were arrested within hours, and the Gestapo now had a thread to pull. The Red Orchestra was beginning to unravel. Suzanne Spaak received word of the arrests through a trusted intermediary, and she knew immediately that the network was in mortal danger. Marguerite had not known much, only a few names and one safe house location, but it was enough. The Gestapo would follow those leads like bloodhounds, arresting anyone connected, torturing them for more names, more locations, until the entire network collapsed. Suzanne called an emergency meeting with her core group, 5 women who had been with her from the beginning, and laid out the brutal reality. They could either disband immediately, scatter, and hope the Gestapo lost the trail, or they could double down, push for one final operation that could justify all the risks they had taken. The decision was not unanimous, but it was clear. They would not run. They had come too far, lost too much to simply vanish into the shadows. They would plan one last mission, something so devastating that even if they were all caught, even if they all died, the Allies would remember what the Red Orchestra had accomplished. The target was a Luftwaffe command center, located in a converted château outside Bruges. British intelligence had been asking for information about this facility for months, but it was heavily guarded, surrounded by barbed wire and patrolled by SS units. The château housed the operational headquarters for Luftwaffe bombing campaigns across the English Channel, which meant it contained flight schedules, target lists, fuel allocations, and communication codes for every bomber squadron in Belgium and northern France. If the Red Orchestra could infiltrate the château and photograph those documents, the intelligence would be priceless. It would also be a suicide mission. The château was impenetrable, and any attempt to get inside would almost certainly result in arrest and execution. But Suzanne had a plan, and it hinged on the one thing the Nazis never expected from women: audacity. The plan required someone to get inside the château not as a spy but as a worker. The Germans were always looking for local labor, maids and cooks and cleaners, women who could be paid a pittance and watched closely. Suzanne's contact, Klaus Weber, the disillusioned Wehrmacht officer, had access to the labor requisition lists for the château, and he agreed to falsify documents for one of the women in the network. The woman chosen for the mission was André de Jong, the artist who had been mapping airfields for months. She was calm under pressure, fluent in German, and skilled at observation. She would pose as a cleaner, gain access to the building, and use a miniature camera smuggled in piece by piece over several days to photograph every document she could find. It was insane, reckless, and brilliant. And if it worked, it would be the crowning achievement of the Red Orchestra. The mission was set for April 15th, and every woman in the network knew that it would likely be their last. André de Jong spent 2 weeks preparing for the infiltration, and every moment felt like walking a tightrope over an abyss. Klaus Weber provided her with forged identification papers that listed her as Marie Dupont, a widow from a small village near the French border, desperate for work. The backstory was simple, believable, the kind of tragic narrative that was all too common in occupied Belgium. Weber also secured her a position on the cleaning staff at the château, a job that would give her access to the administrative wing where the operational documents were kept. But getting the job was only the beginning. André had to memorize her cover story so thoroughly that she could recite it under interrogation without hesitation. She had to learn the layout of the château from hand-drawn maps provided by Weber, maps that showed her which hallways were patrolled, which rooms were locked, and where the documents were most likely stored. And she had to practice using the miniature camera, a device no larger than a cigarette case, until she could photograph a page in under 3 seconds without making a sound. The camera itself was a marvel of espionage engineering, provided by British intelligence through a Swiss intermediary. It was designed to be smuggled in pieces, each component small enough to hide in a seam or a shoe heel, and then assembled on site. Suzanne Spaak coordinated the smuggling operation, using 3 different couriers over the course of a week to move the camera parts into Bruges without attracting attention. The lens came first, hidden inside a bar of soap, then the shutter mechanism tucked into the lining of a handbag, finally the film cartridges, wrapped in wax paper and concealed in a tin of tobacco. Each delivery was a separate risk, each courier a potential point of failure, but all 3 made it through. By the night before the mission, André had the fully assembled camera hidden in the false bottom of a cleaning supply bucket, ready to be carried into the château under the noses of the SS guards. On the morning of April 15th, André walked through the gates of the château with 6 other cleaning women, all of them local hires, none of them aware that the quiet woman with the nervous smile was carrying a camera that could change the course of the war. The SS guards checked their papers, searched their bags with the mechanical efficiency of men who had done this 1,000 times, and waved them through. Andre's heart was hammering so hard she was certain they could hear it, but her face remained calm, her hands steady. She had rehearsed this moment in her mind 100 times, and now that it was real, she felt a strange sense of clarity, as if all the fear had burned away and left only purpose. She was led to the administrative wing, given a mop and a bucket, and told to clean the hallway outside the operations room. The guard who gave her the instructions barely looked at her, just another invisible woman doing invisible work, exactly as Suzanne had predicted. The operations room was locked, but Andre had been watching the guards for 3 days through Weber's intelligence reports, and she knew their routine. Every 2 hours, an officer would enter the room to update the duty logs, and the door would remain unlocked for approximately 10 minutes while he worked. Andre timed her cleaning to coincide with the next scheduled update, positioning herself near the door with her bucket, waiting. When the officer entered, she counted to 60, giving him time to settle at his desk, and then she slipped inside, moving as quietly as a shadow. The room was exactly as Weber had described. A large oak desk covered in papers, filing cabinets along the walls, maps pinned to corkboards showing bomber routes and target locations. Andre pulled the camera from the bucket, her hands moving with practiced precision, and began photographing everything she could reach. Flight schedules, fuel allocation reports, communication frequencies, target lists for upcoming raids on Liverpool and Manchester. Each click of the shutter was a small victory, each page of intelligence a knife in the heart of the Luftwaffe. She worked for 7 minutes, capturing over 40 pages of documents, before she heard footsteps in the hallway outside. The officer was returning earlier than expected, and Andre had seconds to act. She shoved the camera back into the bucket, grabbed her mop and stepped into the hallway, just as the officer rounded the corner. He looked at her, irritated, and barked something in German about staying out of the operations room. Andre nodded, stammered an apology in broken German, and kept her eyes on the floor, the picture of a terrified cleaning woman who had made a mistake. The officer grunted, dismissed her with a wave, and disappeared back into the room, locking the door behind him. Andre walked away, her legs trembling, the bucket heavy in her hands, and she did not allow herself to breathe until she was outside the château and walking down the road toward Bruges. She had done it. The Red Orchestra had just stolen the Luftwaffe's secrets from under their noses, and the Nazis had no idea. The photographs had to reach London as quickly as possible, which meant Andre could not rest, could not celebrate, could not even process what she had just accomplished. The film was too valuable, too time-sensitive to sit in a safe house while the network arranged a leisurely courier route. The intelligence showed planned bombing raids for the following week, which meant the British had days, not weeks, to act on it. Suzanne Spaak made the call. Andre would carry the film herself all the way to the Spanish border, using a route that had only been tested once before. It was 800 miles of occupied territory, checkpoints every 50 miles, and a dozen opportunities to be stopped, searched, and shot. But Andre did not hesitate. She had already crossed the line that separated the living from the dead the moment she walked into that château, and she knew that finishing the mission was the only thing that mattered now. She left Bruges that same night, carrying the film in a hollowed-out book, traveling by train and bus and on foot when necessary, moving through Belgium and into France like a ghost. The journey was a nightmare of close calls and fraying nerves. At a checkpoint outside Lille, a German soldier pulled her aside and demanded to search her bag. Andre handed it over with a trembling smile, her mind racing through exit strategies, calculating whether she could run, whether she could fight, whether she should swallow the film and hope it killed her before the Gestapo could torture her. The soldier rifled through her belongings, pulled out the book, flipped through the pages and handed it back. He had not noticed the hollowed-out center, had not felt the weight of the film hidden inside. He waved her through, bored, already looking for the next person to harass. Andre walked away on shaking legs, her heart screaming in her chest, and kept moving south. Near the Spanish border, she linked up with a Basque smuggler who specialized in moving refugees and resistance operatives across the Pyrenees. The smuggler, a man named Esteban who asked no questions and expected no explanations, guided her through the mountains in the dead of night, a 12-hour hike over frozen trails that left her hands bloody and her lungs burning. But when the sun rose, she was standing on Spanish soil and the film was safe. British intelligence received the photographs in Madrid 3 days later, and the reaction was immediate. The documents André had captured were described in one MI6 report as the single most valuable piece of Luftwaffe intelligence obtained in 1942. The flight schedules alone allowed the RAF to position fighters at exactly the right coordinates, to intercept German bomber formations before they reached their targets. The fuel allocation reports revealed critical shortages that the British exploited by targeting supply depots. The communication frequencies were used to jam German radio transmissions during raids, creating chaos and confusion among Luftwaffe pilots. And the target lists, the specific cities and facilities the Germans planned to bomb, allowed the British to evacuate civilians and reinforce defenses in advance. Over the next 2 months, the Luftwaffe suffered catastrophic losses, losing aircraft at a rate that forced them to scale back operations over Britain entirely. The Red Orchestra had not just provided intelligence, they had delivered a strategic blow that changed the trajectory of the air war. But in Brussels, the cost of that success was about to come due. Heinrich Reiser had not been idle during André's mission. He had continued his methodical dismantling of the resistance network, arresting suspects, torturing them, following every lead no matter how small. And in late April, one of those leads pointed directly at Klaus Weber, the Wehrmacht officer who had been feeding information to Suzanne Spaak. Weber was arrested at his apartment, and within hours, the Gestapo had broken him. He gave them everything. Suzanne's name, her address, the names of the other women in the core group, the locations of safe houses, the identities of couriers. It was a complete betrayal, not out of malice but out of human weakness, the inability to withstand the agony of what Reiser's men did to him in that basement. By the time Weber died from his injuries 2 days later, the Gestapo had a roadmap to the entire Red Orchestra, and Reiser was already mobilizing his forces for a series of coordinated raids. Suzanne Spaak received a warning from a sympathetic police officer, a man who had been feeding her information for months and who risked his life to give her a single message: run now, tonight, because the Gestapo was coming for her at dawn. Suzanne had 12 hours to disappear, to save herself, to vanish into the underground and hope that the network could survive without her. But she did not run. Instead, she spent those 12 hours burning documents, evacuating safe houses, and warning every woman she could reach to scatter and go silent. She made sure that the network would survive her arrest, that the mission would continue even after she was gone. And then, as the first light of dawn broke over Brussels, Suzanne sat in her living room, waiting for the Gestapo to knock on her door. She had made her choice, and she was ready to face the consequences. The Gestapo came for Suzanne Spaak at 5:30 in the morning on May 2nd, 1942, exactly as she knew they would. 6 men in black leather coats, armed with submachine guns, smashing through her front door like a battering ram. They tore through her home, ripping open drawers, overturning furniture, searching for evidence that Suzanne had already destroyed. They found nothing, no documents, no codes, no lists of names, because Suzanne had spent the entire night erasing every trace of the Red Orchestra from her life. But it did not matter. Reiser did not need evidence. He had Weber's confession, and that was enough to justify anything. They dragged Suzanne out of her home in handcuffs, threw her into the back of a truck and drove her to Avenue Louise, to the building where so many of her friends had already disappeared. As the truck pulled away, neighbors watched from behind their curtains, silent, afraid, complicit in their silence. Suzanne did not look back. She had known this moment was coming for months, and she had made peace with it. The interrogations began immediately, and they were as brutal as anything Reiser had ever conducted. They wanted names, addresses, the structure of the network, the identities of the couriers, the location of the British contacts. Suzanne gave them nothing. They beat her, burned her, broke her fingers one by one, and she stared at Reiser with a defiance that enraged him. She understood that every hour she held out was another hour for the other women to escape, another hour for the network to dissolve into the shadows and regroup. Reiser tried everything: threats, false promises, even bringing in other arrested women and torturing them in front of Suzanne to break her will. But Suzanne had spent 2 years preparing for this moment, and she had built walls inside her mind that Reiser could not breach. After 3 days, Reiser realized he was not going to break her, and his rage turned cold. If Suzanne would not talk, then she would serve as an example, a public execution to terrify the rest of the resistance into silence. But Reiser's victory was hollow, because while he had been focused on Suzanne, the rest of the Red Orchestra had done exactly what she intended. They vanished. Hélène Moskowitz fled to France, crossing the border hidden in a shipment of medical supplies. André Dumont disappeared into the Belgian countryside, sheltered by farmers who hated the Nazis more than they feared them. The couriers scattered across Europe, some reaching Britain, others finding refuge in Switzerland. The safe houses were abandoned, the communication networks severed, and within a week the Red Orchestra had ceased to exist as a centralized entity. But the women did not stop working. They went underground, operating in smaller, isolated cells, continuing to gather intelligence and pass it to the Allies through new routes that the Gestapo could not trace. Suzanne's sacrifice had bought them time, and they were determined not to waste it. The intelligence kept flowing to London throughout the summer of 1942, though the Gestapo never understood how. Reiser arrested dozens more suspected resistance members, executed them publicly, plastered Brussels with posters warning that collaboration with the enemy would result in death. But the leaks continued. The Luftwaffe continued to lose planes, and Reiser's reputation began to suffer. His superiors in Berlin demanded results, and Reiser, desperate to prove that he had crushed the network, orchestrated a propaganda campaign claiming that the Red Orchestra had been destroyed. He held press conferences, showed off confiscated equipment, paraded arrested women in front of cameras as proof of his success. But in the quiet offices of British intelligence, analysts were reading fresh reports from Belgium, reports that proved the Red Orchestra was still very much alive, still bleeding the Luftwaffe dry, still winning. Suzanne Spaak spent 4 months in Gestapo custody, moved from Avenue Louise to a military prison outside Brussels, and finally to Ravensbrück concentration camp in Germany. She was never tried, never formally charged, because the Nazis did not bother with legal proceedings for resistance fighters. She was simply another enemy of the Reich, condemned to die slowly in the machinery of the camp system. But even in Ravensbrück, Suzanne did not break. She organized the other prisoners, shared what little food she had, kept their spirits alive with whispered stories of resistance and hope. She survived until January of 1944, when the camp commandant, frustrated by her influence over the other prisoners, ordered her execution. Suzanne Spaak was shot at dawn on January 12th, buried in an unmarked grave, her name erased from official records. The Nazis thought they had silenced her, but they were wrong. The Red Orchestra had already written her into history, a history that would take decades to uncover. While Suzanne was being erased in Ravensbrück, the women she had trained were delivering the final blow to the Luftwaffe's operations in Belgium. By the fall of 1942, the scattered cells of the Red Orchestra had reorganized into something even more dangerous than before, a decentralized network that was nearly impossible to destroy. There was no single leader to arrest, no central safe house to raid, no master list of names for the Gestapo to capture. Each cell operated independently, gathering intelligence and passing it through a chain of intermediaries so complex that even the women involved did not know the full structure. And they had learned from their mistakes. They no longer relied on written messages or physical documents that could be intercepted. Instead, they used verbal codes, memorized intelligence and dead drops that changed locations every week. The Gestapo could arrest one woman, torture her, execute her, and they would gain nothing because she only knew her small piece of the puzzle. The intelligence these women provided in the final year of their operation was staggering in its scope and precision. In September of 1942, a cell operating near the port of Antwerp discovered that the Germans were stockpiling aviation fuel for a massive winter offensive, with plans to launch sustained bombing raids on British industrial cities. The The women mapped the locations of the fuel depots, counted the tanker trucks coming and going, and estimated the total volume of fuel being stored. That information reached London within 2 weeks, and the RAF launched a coordinated strike that destroyed over 60% of the fuel reserves in a single night. The planned winter offensive never happened, not because the Germans changed their minds, but because they no longer had the fuel to execute it. In November, another cell intercepted communications about a new radar installation being built outside Ghent, a facility that would have given the Luftwaffe advance warning of Allied bombing raids. The installation was bombed 3 days before it became operational, based on blueprints that had been photographed by a woman who posed as a construction site secretary. But the most devastating intelligence came in early 1943, when the Red Orchestra uncovered details about Operation Donnerkeil, a secret Luftwaffe plan to redeploy bomber squadrons from Belgium to the Eastern Front to support the faltering German offensive in Russia. The plan involved moving over 200 aircraft, along with their pilots, ground crews, and support infrastructure, in a carefully coordinated transfer that would take place over 2 weeks in March. If successful, it would have given the Germans a significant tactical advantage in the East, potentially prolonging the war by months or even years. But the Red Orchestra learned about Donnerkeil through a careless conversation overheard in a Brussels café, where a Luftwaffe logistics officer had been drinking too heavily and talking too freely. The woman who overheard him, a seamstress named Margot Leclerc, memorized every detail and passed it through the network within hours. British intelligence received the full plan, including the transfer dates, the departure airfields, and the flight routes. The RAF responded with surgical precision. On the first day of the scheduled transfer, British fighters intercepted the German bomber formations over the Channel, shooting down 17 aircraft before they reached French airspace. On the second day, the RAF bombed the staging airfields in Belgium, destroying planes on the ground and killing dozens of pilots. On the third day, the Germans cancelled the operation entirely, realizing that the element of surprise had been completely lost. Operation Donnerkeil never happened, and the Eastern Front never received the air support that might have changed the outcome of critical battles. The cost to the Luftwaffe was catastrophic. Over 50 aircraft destroyed, 100 pilots dead or captured, and the loss of strategic momentum at a time when Germany could least afford it. And the source of the intelligence leak was never discovered, because the Gestapo was still chasing ghosts, still believing that the Red Orchestra had been destroyed months earlier. By the spring of 1943, the Luftwaffe's operational capacity in Belgium had been reduced to a shadow of what it had been in 1941. The 100 aircraft lost over 2 years was not just a number. It represented a decimation of experienced pilots, a depletion of irreplaceable fuel reserves, and a collapse of morale among German aircrews who no longer trusted that their missions would remain secret. The women of the Red Orchestra had achieved something that entire Allied military divisions had struggled to accomplish. They had broken the Luftwaffe's stranglehold on the skies over Western Europe, and they had done it without firing a single shot, without dropping a single bomb, using nothing but their courage, their intelligence, and their willingness to sacrifice everything for a cause greater than themselves. But the cost had been unimaginable, and the final chapter of their story was still to come. The end came swiftly and brutally in the summer of 1943, when the Gestapo finally caught a break they had been hunting for 2 years. A Belgian collaborator, desperate for the reward money that Reiser had been offering, turned in a woman named Juliette Hermans, a pharmacist who had been passing messages for one of the Red Orchestra cells. Juliette was not a corps member, did not know the identities of the leaders, but she knew enough. Under torture, she gave up the location of a safe house in Liège and the name of a courier who was scheduled to pick up a package there the following week. The Gestapo set up surveillance, waited with the patience of predators, and when the courier arrived, they followed her. Not to arrest her immediately, but to see where she went, who she contacted, how the network moved. It was the breakthrough Reiser had been waiting for, and he exploited it with ruthless efficiency. Over the next 6 weeks, the Gestapo tracked the courier to 3 more safe houses, identified 8 more women, and slowly, methodically began rolling up what remained of the Red Orchestra. The arrests happened in waves, coordinated raids across Belgium and northern France, designed to capture as many operatives as possible before the network could react. In Liège, 4 women were taken from their homes in the middle of the night. In Brussels, 2 more were arrested at a train station. In Antwerp, the Gestapo raided an apartment and found a miniature camera hidden in a jewelry box, evidence that sealed the fate of everyone connected to that location. By September of 1943, over 30 women associated with the Red Orchestra had been arrested, and Reiser was convinced he had finally destroyed the network once and for all. The interrogations were savage, designed not just to extract information, but to break the spirit of the resistance. Women were tortured for days, subjected to mock executions, told that their friends had already betrayed them and that confession was their only hope for survival. Some broke, giving up names and locations. Others held firm, choosing death over betrayal, their silence a final act of defiance. The executions began in October, public spectacles designed to terrorize the population into submission. The Gestapo marched the condemned women through the streets of Brussels in chains, forced them to stand before hastily assembled firing squads in city squares, while crowds watched in horrified silence. Margot Leclerc, the seamstress who had uncovered Operation Donnerkeil, was among the first to die, shot in the back of the head and left in the street as a warning. Helene Moskowitz, the nurse who had spent years listening to German soldiers and passing their secrets to the Allies, was executed in Antwerp, her body dumped in a mass grave. André Dumont, the courier who had made over 30 border crossings, was caught trying to reach Spain and executed at the French border. One by one, the women of the Red Orchestra were erased, their names stricken from records, their contributions buried under layers of Nazi propaganda that claimed they were traitors, criminals, enemies of the state. But the Gestapo made a critical mistake. They assumed that arresting the women meant stopping the intelligence. They did not understand that the Red Orchestra had evolved into something that could not be killed by arrests alone. Even as the core operatives were being executed, the information they had gathered was still moving through the network, still reaching London, still being acted upon by Allied commanders. The intelligence pipeline had become self-sustaining, a machine that continued to function even as its creators were being dismantled. New women stepped in to replace the ones who had been arrested, younger, more cautious, learning from the mistakes of their predecessors. The network shrank, became quieter, but it did not die, and the Luftwaffe continued to suffer losses, continued to see their operations compromised, continued to bleed aircraft and pilots in ways they could not explain. By the end of 1943, the Red Orchestra, as Suzanne Spaak had built it, was gone, its members dead or scattered, its safe houses burned, its couriers executed. But the legacy of what those women had accomplished lived on in every German plane that fell from the sky, every bombing raid that never reached its target, every Allied life saved by intelligence that had been gathered at the cost of unimaginable sacrifice. The Gestapo claimed victory, erected monuments to their success in crushing the resistance, but in the quiet rooms where British intelligence officers reviewed the war's progress, there was a different accounting. The Red Orchestra had not just fought the Nazis, they had beaten them, had proven that courage and conviction could stand against the machinery of totalitarian terror and win. The question that remained was whether their story would ever be told, or whether it would be buried, along with the women who had given everything to create it. For decades after the war ended, the story of the Red Orchestra remained buried, hidden under layers of Cold War politics and deliberate historical erasure. The Soviet Union claimed the Red Orchestra as their own operation, rewriting the narrative to emphasize communist resistance and downplaying the role of the Belgian women who had actually built the network. The Western Allies, embarrassed that they had not done more to protect their sources, and uncomfortable with the socialist leanings of some of the operatives, quietly shelved the intelligence reports and allowed the story to fade into obscurity. Suzanne Spaak's name appeared in no history books, no memorials, no official records. André de Jong survived the war but never spoke publicly about her role, dying in 1976 without ever receiving recognition for the château infiltration that had changed the course of the air war. The other women, the ones who had been executed or who had disappeared into unmarked graves, were forgotten entirely, their sacrifices erased by governments that found their stories inconvenient or politically complicated. It was not until the 1990s, when Soviet archives were finally opened and Belgian historians began digging through wartime records, that the true scope of the Red Orchestra's accomplishments began to emerge. Researchers discovered intelligence reports that detailed how the network had provided the Allies with over 300 separate pieces of actionable intelligence between 1941 and 1943, intelligence that had directly contributed to the loss of 100 Luftwaffe aircraft and the disruption of dozens of major German military operations. They found testimonies from British intelligence officers who described the Red Orchestra as one of the most effective espionage networks of the entire war, more valuable than many formal military units. And they uncovered the names of the women who had made it all possible, women whose courage and sacrifice had been deliberately hidden for 50 years because their story did not fit the Cold War narratives that both East and West wanted to tell. The recognition came too late for most of them. Suzanne Spaak was posthumously awarded the Croix de Guerre by the Belgian government in 2002, 60 years after her execution. A small plaque was placed on the building where she had lived in Brussels, a monument so modest that most people walk past it without noticing. André de Jong was honored by the British government in 2007 with a mention in a military history exhibit, a single paragraph in a display case that barely scratched the surface of what she had accomplished. The other women, the couriers and the safe house operators, and the ordinary citizens who had risked everything, received nothing at all, their names still lost to history, their families never knowing the full truth of what their mothers and grandmothers had done. The Red Orchestra became a footnote, a curiosity, a story mentioned briefly in academic papers and specialized documentaries, but never given the prominence it deserved in the larger narrative of World War II. But the legacy of these women extends far beyond plaques and awards. The intelligence they provided saved countless Allied lives, shortened the air war over Britain, and contributed to the eventual defeat of Nazi Germany. The 100 aircraft they helped bring down represented more than metal and fuel. They represented German pilots who never bombed another city, supply lines that never reached the front, operations that never succeeded because the element of surprise had been stripped away. Every life saved by a bombing raid that never happened. Every city that was not reduced to rubble. Every soldier who came home because the Luftwaffe had been crippled. All of it traces back to the courage of women who decided that doing nothing was worse than dying. They fought a war without weapons, won battles without firing a shot, and proved that the most powerful weapon against tyranny is not violence, but the refusal to be silent. The story of the Red Orchestra matters today because it reminds us that history is full of invisible heroes, people whose contributions were deliberately erased because they did not fit convenient narratives or serve political agendas. It reminds us that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to act in spite of it. And it reminds us that the fight against fascism, against tyranny, against injustice has always been won not by armies alone, but by ordinary people who chose to become extraordinary. Suzanne Spaak and the women of the Red Orchestra did not live to see their story told, but their legacy endures in every generation that refuses to look away from evil, that refuses to accept oppression, that refuses to let the powerful erase the truth. They were teachers, nurses, artists, housewives, and they became warriors. They were the Red Orchestra, and this is the story they tried to erase from history.